Ethan Caldwell was no stranger to success. At just 34 years old, he had built an empire from the ground up. His tech company, Caldwell Innovations, was worth billions and employed thousands of people worldwide. Ethan's days were filled with boardroom meetings, investor pitches, and endless emails. He lived in a penthouse overlooking the city skyline, drove luxury cars, and attended high-profile events where everyone wanted a piece of him. But despite all his achievements, there was one area of Ethan's life that remained painfully empty: his personal relationships. It wasn't that Ethan didn't want love or companionship. It was more that he simply hadn't found time for it. Between building his business and managing its rapid growth, romance had taken a back seat. The last serious relationship he'd been in ended 5 years ago, and even now, thinking about it made his chest tighten. Her name was Charlotte, and she had been everything he thought he wanted: intelligent, ambitious, and beautiful. They met during their college years when Ethan was still dreaming big, but struggling financially. For a while they were inseparable, sharing late-night conversations about their future and cheering each other on as they pursued their goals. But then came the turning point. As Ethan's startup began gaining traction, his workload increased exponentially. Late nights at the office became the norm, and weekends disappeared into a blur of coding marathons and strategy sessions. Charlotte tried to be supportive, but eventually the strain grew too much. One evening over dinner at a quiet cafe, she told him she needed stability, a partner who could give her time and attention, not someone constantly chasing the next big thing. A week later, she started dating another man, someone more grounded, as she put it. That was the last straw for Ethan. He threw himself into his work, determined to prove that his sacrifices would pay off. Years passed, and Ethan achieved everything he set out to do. Yet deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He often wondered if he'd made the right choice, sacrificing love for ambition. And then, one unassuming Tuesday morning, an envelope arrived in the mail that forced those buried emotions to resurface. It was cream-colored, embossed with gold lettering, and addressed to Mr. Ethan Caldwell in elegant cursive handwriting. Curious, Ethan opened it and pulled out a card. His breath caught in his throat as he read the words, "You're cordially invited to celebrate the marriage of Charlotte Bennett and James Harper." Charlotte was getting married. Ethan stared at the invitation, his mind racing. Part of him felt proud of her. He knew she deserved happiness, but another part couldn't help but feel a pang of regret. What if things had gone differently? Would they have ended up here together instead of apart? Shaking his head, Ethan tried to push the thoughts aside. This wasn't about him anymore. Still, as he placed the invitation on his desk, he noticed a small note at the bottom of the card. Guests are encouraged to bring a date. A date. The idea hit Ethan like a ton of bricks. He hadn't been in a meaningful relationship since Charlotte, and the thought of showing up alone to her wedding felt unbearable. Everyone would assume he was still that lonely workaholic who couldn't balance his professional and personal life. That image grated against every fiber of his being. He refused to let anyone see him as weak or incomplete. But what could he do? Finding a date on such short notice seemed impossible. That afternoon, Ethan met his best friend Marcus for lunch at their favorite Italian restaurant. Over plates of pasta and glasses of red wine, Ethan vented about the situation. Marcus listened intently, occasionally nodding or offering sympathetic comments. When Ethan finished explaining, Marcus leaned back in his chair and smirked. "Why don't you just hire a date?" he suggested casually. "Hire a date?" Ethan repeated, raising an eyebrow. "That sounds desperate." "Desperate times call for desperate measures," Marcus replied with a shrug. "Besides, it's not like you haven't hired people for weirder reasons before." Ethan chuckled despite himself. While the idea of paying someone to pretend to be his girlfriend sounded ridiculous, it also sparked a glimmer of intrigue. Then again, did he really want to trust a stranger with something so important? Before he could dwell on it further, Marcus pulled out his phone and opened a dating. "A pay?" Or, Marcus said with a mischievous grin, "you could swipe your way to true love." Ethan groaned but reluctantly took the phone. He scrolled through profiles half-heartedly until one caught his eye. It belonged to a woman named Sophie Bennett. Her profile picture showed her laughing with a corgi wearing oversized sunglasses perched on its nose. Something about her carefree expression and quirky sense of humor intrigued him. Without overthinking it, Ethan swiped right. To his surprise, Sophie matched with him almost immediately. Within minutes they exchanged messages. Sophie's tone was playful yet genuine, and Ethan found himself smiling as he typed out his unusual request. "Hey," he wrote, "I know this sounds crazy, but I need a favor." He explained the situation briefly, emphasizing that it would only be for one weekend and that he'd compensate her generously for her time. Sophie's response came quickly. "Let me get this straight. You want me to pose as your girlfriend at your ex's wedding?" she asked, followed by a laughing emoji. "This has to be the wildest thing I've ever heard." Ethan laughed too, relieved that she didn't seem offended or judgmental. After some back-and-forth banter, Sophie agreed to meet him for coffee to discuss the details. As Ethan set his phone down, he realized he was looking forward to it more than he expected. There was something refreshing about Sophie's straightforwardness and humor. She wasn't intimidated by his wealth or status, which was rare in his world. The coffee shop where Ethan and Sophie agreed to meet was tucked away on a quiet street, far from the bustling downtown area where Ethan usually spent his days. It had a cozy, artsy vibe with mismatched furniture, shelves lined with secondhand books, and the faint aroma of freshly baked pastries wafting through the air. Ethan arrived 10 minutes early, partly out of habit. He always liked being punctual, and partly because he felt nervous. He wasn't sure what to expect from Sophie. Would she be as funny and down-to-earth in person as she seemed online? Or would this whole plan fall apart before it even began? He chose a table near the window, ordered himself a black coffee, and waited. His mind wandered as he watched people pass by outside, couples holding hands, delivery drivers rushing to their next stop, and kids chasing each other with balloons. For a moment, Ethan allowed himself to imagine what it might feel like to have someone special waiting for him at home after long days at work. But just as quickly, he shook the thought away. This wasn't about fantasies. It was about solving a problem. Then she walked in. Sophie stood out immediately, not because she was dressed extravagantly or carried herself with an air of confidence, but because there was something effortlessly real about her. She wore a simple denim jacket over a striped shirt, paired with jeans that looked like they'd seen better days. Her curly brown hair framed her face in loose waves, and her bright green eyes scanned the room until they landed on Ethan. When she spotted him, she smiled, a warm, genuine smile that instantly put him at ease. "Ethan?" she asked as she approached the table, clutching a tote bag that read "Books and Beans" in bold letters. "That's me," Ethan replied, standing up to greet her. "And you must be Sophie." They shook hands briefly before sitting down. A barista came over to take Sophie's order, and she opted for a chai latte with extra cinnamon. Once the formalities were out of the way, Ethan launched into an explanation of why he needed her help. He told her about Charlotte, their past relationship, how they'd drifted apart, and how receiving the wedding invitation had stirred up old feelings. He admitted that while he wanted to appear confident and composed at the event, he didn't want to show up alone either. Sophie listened intently, nodding occasionally but never interrupting. When Ethan finished speaking, she leaned back in her chair and let out a low whistle. "Wow," she said with a grin. "You weren't kidding when you said this was wild." "I know it sounds insane," Ethan admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "But I promise it'll be worth your time. All I'm asking is for one weekend. We can make up a backstory, practice our lines, whatever it takes." Sophie tilted her head thoughtfully, studying him for a moment. "Why me?" she asked finally. "I mean, you could have hired a professional actor or picked someone who looks more polished." Her question caught Ethan off guard. He hadn't really considered why he'd chosen Sophie specifically. It had felt instinctive, almost like fate nudging him in her direction. After a pause, he shrugged and said, "Because you seem real, like genuinely yourself. And honestly, I don't think I could pull off pretending with someone fake. Sophie raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. Fair enough. But let's get one thing straight. I'm not doing this for the money. Well, okay. Maybe a little for the money, she added with a laugh. But mostly I'm curious. I've never been to a fancy wedding before, and I kind of want to see what all the fuss is about. Ethan chuckled, grateful for her lightheartedness. They spent the next hour brainstorming ideas for their cover story. They decided to say they'd met through mutual friends at a charity gala 6 months ago, hit it off immediately, and had been dating ever since. To make things believable, they agreed to share some quirky details about their relationship, like how they bonded over their shared love of bad puns and spontaneous road trips. As they talked, Ethan found himself relaxing more than he had in years. Sophie had a way of making conversations flow naturally, whether she was teasing him about his obsession with productivity apps or sharing funny anecdotes about her dog, Waffles. At one point, she pulled out her phone to show him a video of Waffles attempting to catch bubbles in the backyard. The sight of the wobbly-legged corgi tumbling around made Ethan laugh so hard that tears welled up in his eyes. For Sophie, the meeting was equally enjoyable. She hadn't expected Ethan to be so easygoing or so handsome. Sure, he was ridiculously wealthy and successful, but there was no arrogance in the way he carried himself. Instead, he came across as surprisingly humble, almost self-conscious, at times. It intrigued her. Most men in his position would have been brimming with ego, but Ethan seemed genuinely unsure of himself when it came to matters of the heart. By the time they wrapped up their discussion, both felt optimistic about the plan. Ethan handed Sophie a folder containing details about the wedding venue, schedule, and key guests, along with a check for $5,000 as a token of appreciation. Sophie hesitated for a moment before accepting it, insisting that she'd return it if things didn't work out. Ethan assured her that wouldn't happen, though deep down he couldn't shake the feeling that this arrangement might end up meaning more to him than he originally anticipated. Before parting ways, Sophie glanced at Ethan and smirked. So, does this mean we're officially fake dating now? Ethan returned her smile, the corners of his lips curving upward in a way that made his usually stern expression soften. Guess so, he replied. Just don't embarrass me too much, okay? Oh, I make no promises, Sophie teased, waving goodbye as she headed toward the door. As she stepped outside, Ethan watched her go, a strange warmth spreading through his chest. For the first time in ages, he felt genuinely excited about someone, that wasn't tied to his career or company. Unbeknownst to either of them, this chance encounter marked the beginning of a journey neither could have predicted. What started as a practical solution to an awkward situation was slowly turning into something far more meaningful. And as Ethan settled back into his seat, sipping his now cold coffee, he realized he couldn't wait to see what happened next. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, with the sun casting golden rays over rolling hills dotted with rows of grapevines. Ethan and Sophie had agreed to meet at a small cafe near the vineyard where the ceremony would take place. As Ethan pulled up in his sleek black SUV, he couldn't help but feel a mix of nerves and anticipation bubbling in his stomach. This was it, the moment when their carefully crafted plan would either succeed or crumble entirely. Sophie arrived shortly after, stepping out of an Uber wearing a flowing emerald green dress that hugged her curves perfectly before cascading down to her ankles. Her hair was styled into soft waves, and she carried a clutch that matched her shoes. For a moment, Ethan forgot how to breathe. She looked stunning. Not overly done, but effortlessly elegant. It wasn't just her appearance that caught his attention. It was the way she carried herself with quiet confidence, as if she belonged in any room she walked into. You look amazing, Ethan said sincerely as he opened the car door for her. Sophie grinned, clearly pleased by the compliment. Thanks. You clean up pretty well yourself. Ethan chuckled, adjusting the knot of his charcoal gray tie. He'd opted for a classic suit paired with a white shirt, simple yet sophisticated. Together they made quite the picture, polished, put together, and undeniably convincing as a couple. As they drove toward the venue, Sophie reviewed their backstory one last time. Okay, so we met at a charity gala 6 months ago, bonded over our shared hatred of olives, and now we're madly in love. Got it? She turned to Ethan with a mischievous glint in her eye. Just don't screw this up, Mr. CEO. Don't worry, Ethan replied, though his fingers tightened slightly on the steering wheel. I've got this. When they arrived at the vineyard, the scene was nothing short of breathtaking. Twinkling fairy lights were strung between towering oak trees and long tables adorned with floral centerpieces stretched across the lawn. Guests mingled beneath ivory tents, sipping champagne and chatting animatedly. The air buzzed with excitement, and Ethan felt a pang of nostalgia as memories of his own life with Charlotte surfaced briefly before fading away. They were greeted almost immediately by Charlotte's mother, Margaret, a woman known for her sharp tongue and even sharper judgment. Dressed in a pale pink suit, she approached them with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Ethan, darling," she exclaimed, air-kissing his cheeks. "It's been too long." "It has," Ethan agreed smoothly, gesturing toward Sophie. "Margaret, this is my girlfriend, Sophie Bennett." Sophie extended her hand gracefully, offering a warm smile. "It's lovely to meet you, Mrs. Harper." Margaret raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Girlfriend? Well, isn't that interesting? How did you two meet?" Without missing a beat, Sophie launched into their rehearsed story, embellishing it with charming details about their first date, a rooftop dinner under the stars, and their shared love for spontaneous weekend getaways. Ethan chimed in occasionally, adding little anecdotes that made the tale sound even more authentic. By the end of the conversation, Margaret seemed genuinely impressed, though Ethan noticed a flicker of skepticism in her gaze. Throughout the afternoon, Ethan found himself growing increasingly protective of Sophie. Every time someone asked probing questions or gave her a skeptical glance, he instinctively stepped closer, resting a hand on her back or interlacing their fingers. To anyone watching, they appeared completely smitten, and truthfully, Ethan didn't have to fake much of it. Being around Sophie felt easy, natural, like slipping into a favorite sweater. He liked the way her laughter lit up her face, how her eyes sparkled when she told stories, and how comfortable she seemed in her own skin. During cocktail hour, Sophie excelled at charming the crowd. She struck up conversations with ease, finding common ground with everyone from Charlotte's college friends to distant relatives. At one point, she even won over James's notoriously grumpy uncle by recounting a hilarious story about Waffles attempting to eat an entire pizza box. Ethan watched from afar, marveling at how effortlessly she navigated social situations. In contrast, he often felt stiff and awkward at events like these, but Sophie's presence somehow loosened him up. Dinner was served under the stars, with candles flickering softly and glass holders scattered across the tables. Ethan and Sophie were seated next to Charlotte and James, along with a few other close friends. As plates of gourmet food were passed around, conversation flowed freely. Charlotte, radiant in her lace wedding gown, leaned over at one point and whispered to Ethan, "She seems wonderful. Are you happy?" Ethan hesitated, caught off guard by the question. Was he happy? Before he could respond, Sophie chimed in, squeezing his hand affectionately. "He's definitely happier with me around," she teased, winking at Charlotte. Charlotte laughed, seemingly satisfied with the answer, but Ethan felt a twinge of unease. There was something disarming about hearing Sophie talk about their relationship, even if it was all pretend. For a fleeting second, he wondered what it might be like if it weren't. Later, during the speeches, emotions ran high. Friends and family took turns sharing heartfelt stories about Charlotte and James, their voices cracking with emotion. When it came time for Charlotte to speak, she thanked everyone for coming and expressed gratitude for the support she'd received throughout her life. Then, glancing at Ethan, she added softly, "And to those who've been part of my journey, even if our paths diverged, I'll always cherish the memories we created." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Ethan felt his chest tighten, old wounds reopening despite his best efforts to keep them buried. Beside him, Sophie squeezed his hand again, grounding him in the present. He glanced at her, grateful for her silent support. After the speeches, the dance floor opened, and guests began swaying to the music. Ethan surprised himself by asking Sophie to dance, pulling her gently onto the floor. As they moved together, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, he realized he hadn't felt this content in years. The world outside, the pressures of work, the weight of expectations, faded into the background. For the first time in a long time, Ethan allowed himself to simply exist in the moment, holding on to someone who made him feel alive. As the night wore on, Ethan knew he was walking a fine line between reality and pretense. Sophie was supposed to be a temporary solution, a stand-in to save face at a difficult event. But somewhere along the way, she had become something more, or at least she was starting to. And as fireworks exploded overhead, painting the sky in bursts of color, Ethan couldn't help but wonder if this charade might lead to something real after all. As the night wore on, the wedding celebration reached its peak. The dance floor was alive with laughter and music, fairy lights twinkling above like a canopy of stars. Ethan and Sophie had moved seamlessly through the evening, their chemistry undeniable to anyone watching. They laughed together during dinner, shared knowing glances when someone made an awkward toast, and even stole moments on the edge of the dance floor where they whispered jokes only they understood. To everyone else, they were the perfect couple, happy, in sync, and deeply in love. But beneath the surface, cracks began to show. Charlotte, radiant in her wedding gown, pulled Ethan aside during a lull in the festivities. She led him to a quiet corner of the vineyard, away from prying eyes and curious ears. The soft glow of lanterns illuminated her face as she turned to him, her expression a mix of nostalgia and uncertainty. "Ethan," she began hesitantly, "I need to say something." Ethan's heart sank. He'd been dreading this moment ever since he arrived at the wedding. He knew Charlotte well enough to recognize that look, the one she got when she wanted to talk about something serious. Still, he nodded, steeling himself for whatever came next. "What is it?" She took a deep breath before speaking. "I've thought about us a lot lately, about everything we went through and why it ended. I don't know if you felt the same way, but sometimes I wonder if I made a mistake." Her words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. For years he'd convinced himself that he was over Charlotte, that their breakup had been painful but necessary. But hearing her admit regret now stirred up emotions he thought he'd buried long ago. His chest tightened, and his mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Did he still have feelings for her? Or was this just the lingering ache of unfinished business? Before he could respond, Charlotte continued, her voice trembling slightly. "You were so passionate, Ethan, so driven. And yes, maybe I wasn't ready for all of that back then, but looking at you now, I see how far you've come. You're exactly who I always hoped you'd be." She paused, searching his face for some sign of agreement or understanding. "Do you think things could have been different if we'd stayed together?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and loaded with implications. Ethan opened his mouth to reply but found no words. How could he answer honestly without hurting her, or himself? Before he could gather his thoughts, movement caught his eye. Sophie stood a few feet away, her expression unreadable as she watched the exchange unfold. Realizing she'd been spotted, Sophie quickly masked her surprise with a polite smile. "Sorry to interrupt," she said lightly, though her tone betrayed a hint of unease. "I just wanted to check if everything's okay." For a moment, no one spoke. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, Ethan cleared his throat and stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Sophie's arm. "Everything's fine," he assured her, his gaze flickering briefly to Charlotte before returning to Sophie. "We were just catching up." Sophie nodded, though her smile faltered slightly. "Right, well, I'll leave you two to it." With that, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Ethan watched her go, guilt gnawing at him. He hadn't meant for Sophie to feel like an outsider, especially not tonight. She'd agreed to help him navigate this complicated situation, and here he was, letting old wounds resurface and potentially jeopardizing everything they'd built, even If it was fake, Ethan? Charlotte's voice brought him back to the present. Are you okay? He shook his head, forcing himself to focus. Look, Charlotte, I appreciate you saying all of this, but it doesn't change anything. We're different people now. Our lives have taken separate paths, and that's okay. It was hard to say the words, but as they left his lips, he realized they were true. No matter how much he once cared for Charlotte, she wasn't the person standing beside him anymore. That role belonged to someone else entirely. With that, Ethan excused himself and went in search of Sophie. He found her on the balcony overlooking the vineyard, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she stared out at the horizon. Fireworks burst overhead, painting the sky in vibrant hues of red, gold, and blue. But Sophie didn't seem to notice. Her shoulders were tense, her posture guarded. Hey, Ethan said softly, stepping closer. Can we talk? Sophie glanced at him briefly before turning her attention back to the view. Sure. Talk. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'm sorry you had to see that. It wasn't what it looked like. Oh, really? Sophie replied, her voice tinged with sarcasm. Because it looked like your ex was questioning whether she made the right choice leaving you. And honestly, Ethan, I can't blame her. You're smart, successful, good-looking. It's easy to see why someone would regret letting you go. Her words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they carried a ring of truth. Yet there was something else beneath her tone. Hurt, perhaps, or disappointment. Ethan hated that he might have caused either. It's not about her, he said firmly, taking another step toward her. It's never been about her. Not anymore. Yes, we have history, but that's all it is. History. What matters now is... He trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. What did matter now? Was it the connection he felt with Sophie? The way she challenged him, made him laugh, and reminded him of what it meant to truly live? Sophie finally turned to face him, her green eyes searching his. What matters now, Ethan? Because I need to know. Am I just part of your plan to get through this weekend, or is there something real here? Her honesty caught him off guard, but it also forced him to confront his own feelings. Over the past few days, Sophie had become more than just a hired date. She'd become someone he genuinely enjoyed spending time with, someone who made him feel seen in ways he hadn't experienced in years. If he was being honest with himself, and with her, he didn't want this to end after the wedding. I don't know what this is yet, Ethan admitted, his voice low but sincere. But I do know that I don't want it to stop. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Not anytime soon. Sophie studied him for a long moment, her expression softening. Then, slowly, she smiled. Well, that's a start. They stood there together, watching the fireworks light up the sky, neither of them saying a word. But the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with possibility. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan allowed himself to imagine a future that didn't revolve solely around work or ambition. Maybe happiness wasn't something he had to chase relentlessly. Maybe it was already within reach, standing right beside him, waiting for him to let her in. As the final bursts of color faded into darkness, Ethan reached for Sophie's hand, intertwining their fingers. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing for certain. He didn't want to face it alone. The morning after the wedding dawned quiet and serene, a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions from the night before. Ethan woke up early, lying in bed as sunlight streamed through the large windows of his penthouse apartment. His mind replayed fragments of the evening, Sophie's laughter echoing under the stars, Charlotte's confession lingering like an unresolved melody, and the way Sophie had looked at him when he finally admitted his feelings. That moment on the balcony, with fireworks lighting up the sky, felt like a turning point not just for their arrangement but for his entire life. He got out of bed and made himself a cup of coffee, standing by the window as the city slowly came to life below. For years, this view had been his sanctuary, a reminder of how far he'd come. But today it felt different. The skyscrapers and bustling streets seemed less impressive, overshadowed by the clarity that had settled over him. Success wasn't meaningless, but it wasn't everything either. What good was building an empire if you didn't have someone to share it with? By mid-morning, Sophie arrived at his place. She'd agreed to meet him one last time to return the folder of wedding details and officially close the chapter on their fake dating agreement. When Ethan opened the door, she greeted him with a warm smile, wearing a casual sundress and carrying her ever-present tote bag. "Morning," she said brightly. "Hope I'm not interrupting your CEO routine." "Not at all," Ethan replied, stepping aside to let her in. "I actually wanted to talk to you about something." They settled into the living room, sitting across from each other on sleek leather couches. Sophie placed the folder on the coffee table, her expression softening as she studied him. "What's on your mind?" Ethan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Last night, it meant something to me. More than I expected. And I don't want it to end here." Sophie raised an eyebrow, intrigued but cautious. "Are you saying you want to keep pretending we're dating? Because I think people might start asking questions after a while." "No," Ethan said quickly, shaking his head. "I mean, I want us to be real. Whatever this is between us, I want to explore it, if you're willing." For a moment, Sophie didn't respond. She leaned back against the couch, her fingers drumming lightly on the armrest as she considered his words. Then, breaking into a grin, she said, "Well, that's quite the plot twist. The Millionaire CEO wants to date me for real?" "I know. It sounds crazy," Ethan admitted, smiling sheepishly. "But there's something about you, Sophie. You make me feel grounded, like I can breathe again. And I don't want to lose that." Sophie's smile softened, her teasing tone giving way to sincerity. "You know, most guys would have scared me off by now. But somehow you haven't. Maybe because you're not trying to impress anyone, not even yourself. Not anymore, anyway." "That's because of you," Ethan said earnestly. "You remind me of what really matters: fun, connection, just being present instead of always chasing the next big thing." Sophie nodded thoughtfully, her eyes meeting his. "Okay then, let's give it a shot. No pretenses, no scripts. Just us." Relief washed over Ethan's face, followed by a wave of excitement he hadn't felt in years. He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Thank you," he said simply, "for saying yes, and for everything else." Over the following weeks, their relationship blossomed in ways neither of them anticipated. They started small, spending weekends exploring local farmers markets, hiking trails, and cozy cafes. Ethan introduced Sophie to waffles, who immediately took a liking to her, and Sophie dragged Ethan to art galleries and indie film screenings he never would have attended otherwise. Their differences complemented each other perfectly. Ethan's structured approach balanced Sophie's free-spirited nature, while her spontaneity pushed him out of his comfort zone. At work, Ethan noticed a change too. For the first time, he began delegating tasks more effectively, trusting his team to handle responsibilities without micromanaging every detail. He left the office earlier some evenings, prioritizing dinner plans with Sophie or simply unwinding at home with a book. His colleagues remarked on how relaxed and approachable he seemed, qualities they hadn't associated with him before. One evening, as they sat on Ethan's balcony watching the sunset, Sophie turned to him with a playful smirk. "So, Mr. Caldwell, how does it feel to have fallen for someone completely unexpected?" Ethan chuckled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Terrifying. Exciting. Worth it." Their journey wasn't without challenges, of course. There were moments when old habits threatened to resurface. For Ethan, the urge to prioritize work over personal time. For Sophie, doubts about whether she could fit into his high-powered world. But they faced these hurdles together, communicating openly and supporting each other through every step. Months later, during a quiet weekend getaway, Ethan surprised Sophie with tickets to Paris. As they strolled along the Seine, sharing crepes, and marveling at the Eiffel Tower, Sophie glanced at him and grinned. "You know, when I swiped right on you, I never imagined ending up here." "Neither did I," Ethan admitted, pulling her closer. "But I wouldn't trade it for anything." In the end, their story wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was about two people finding each other in the unlikeliest. of circumstances and choosing to build something authentic together. What began as a solution to an awkward problem became a love story neither of them saw coming, but one they wouldn't trade for the world.